Chapter 14. We got to the restaurant. I could see that it was someone's living room, that they'd set up about 10 card tables and folding chairs in. Every table but one was filled, and there were 5 or 6 people standing in the doorway waiting to sit down. We said, "Excuse us," and walked right past. Then the smell of the place got into my nose, and I could tell why folks were lining up to get in. I closed my eyes and took a big snort of air. It was like someone took an old pot and poured about 100 gallons of hot apple cider and 100 gallons of hot coffee into it, and then stirred 8 or 9 sweet potato pies, crust and all, into that. Let that 6 big steamy meatloaf float atop all of that, and then threw a couple of handfuls of smashed potatoes and boiled the whole thing on high. This must be exactly how heaven smells. I could tell by the smell that Mr. Jimmy was telling the truth when he said this was the best restaurant in Grand Rapids. Shucks, I've never even eaten in one before, but I'd say this was the best restaurant in the world. I opened my eyes because the smell was starting to get to me dizzy. The other side of the room, Hermione Calloway was sitting at a table with Mr. Jimmy and a woman. Steady Eddie pointed to the empty table, one that had a sign that said reserved NBC on top of it. And that stood that's where we are over there, bud. NBC stands for Nobody But Calloway. Mr. C changes the name of the band so much that no one can keep up with the new names, so they call us NBC. So they don't have to keep change the sign. Before I could sit down with them, Mr. Jimmy saw and said, "Hey there." "They are?" And he pointed at me and waved for me to come over and sit at their table. Shucks, I'd rather sit with the band than with Hermione Calloway. It would be hard enough good time eating if you looked up and saw him every time he took a bite. The thug said, "Remember what I said," and pointed to the top of his head and acted like he was smacking some kisses. I walked to the other side of the table. Mr. Jimmy said, "Bud, this here's Miss Thomas. She's our vocal stylist." She could tell I didn't know what that meant, so she said, "I'm their singer, honey." I said, "Oh, pleased to meet you, ma'am." She laughed, stuck her hand out for me to shake. There were about 9 diamond rings on just her right hand. She said, "Oh my, a gentleman. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance as well." She took all those ringed up fingers and rubbed them across my cheek, and she held my chin and said, "Come here, child," and she pulled my face close to hers. Uh-oh. I twisted up my face to get ready for a kiss, but instead she looked real close at me and said, "What's this, baby?" She rubbed her fingers over a couple of sting spots that I'd been scratching. For a second I was going to tell her they were vampire bites, but something told me to tell the truth this time. "Oh, just some hornet stings, ma'am. I got bit up by when the Amoses locked me in their shed." It was her turn to twist up her face. "When who? Locked you in what shed?" They were the people the home was paying to look after me. By I got bit by their fish head guards. I showed the woman the bite on my hand. I was surprised to see it was puffing out from pus. "My lord," she said, "Herman, this child's hand's infected. None of you men notice how he looks?" Hermione Calloway said, "Talk to James. Far as I know, he's the only one who looked at this kid." Mr. Jimmy said, "Well, Grace, to be truthful, I did think the boy's face was a little swollen up, but you know how dark it is in the cabin, and by God, there are some folks who just naturally have lopsided heads." She said, "Dark or not, even blind Lemon Jefferson could see that there was something wrong with this baby's eye. What happened here, Bud?" She touched underneath my eye. It was as light as a feather. I said, "Well, ma'am, Todd Amos woke me up by shoving a pencil all the way up my nose, all the way to the R, and when I punched him, he slapped me, and slapped him instead. He left a big welt on my cheek. So he went and put up his dukes and went at it, and he didn't take long before I knew I couldn't whip him, so I just curled up and fell down." I looked at Hermione Calloway to make sure he was listening to the next part. I wanted him to know, even though he was a real mean and our minds thought about things the exact same way. And I said, I fell down, ma'am, 'cause the Lord give me the good sense to know when enough is enough. He acted like he didn't hear, so I kept talking to Miss Thomas. Then Miss Amos came in, and I could tell they'd gone through my suitcase. They even though they promised they wouldn't, and she locked me up in a shed where the hornets and fish head guards got hold me. Miss Thomas looked like this was some real amazing news. Hermione Calloway, sounds like a case of diarrhea of the mouth and constipation of the brain. Miss Thomas gave him a dirty look and said, You said the home. Bud, what kind of home? Where's your mamma? I said, She died 4 years ago, ma'am. She put her hand on my shoulder and said, I'm sorry, sweetheart. How about your daddy? Do you know where he is at? I said, Yes, ma'am. She said, Where is he, honey? I pointed dead at Hermione Calloway's big belly again. That's him right there. Miss Thomas looked like she wanted to smile, but she said, Now, Bud, I've known you for a couple of minutes, and I can tell your mama did a fine job of raising you. I can see you've had a real good, proper upbringing, but I'm kind of surprised you're pointing like that. She was right. I brought my finger down. I'm sorry, ma'am. She said, That's fine, but it wasn't me who got pointed at. I told Hermione Calloway, I'm sorry, sir, but I didn't mean it. She smiled and said, That's better. We all make mistakes. You know what, Bud? You look like you could use a good meal, so why don't you sit right there and join us? And she pointed to a ring covered finger to an empty chair directly across from him. Shucks. How could anyone enjoy their food with Hermione Calloway staring back at you? But maybe my luck was starting to change. As soon as I sat down, Hermione Calloway picked up his coffee cup and said, If you'll excuse me, this is about where I came in. He walked over where the band was sitting. He told them, All right, someone's got to give me their seat and go sit with James and Miss Grace. Oh, and my son. For a second, it looked like a stampede of dusky devastators of the Depression were all jumped up at once and started heading for our table. They saw what they'd done, laughed. Steady Eddie said, Take my seat, Mr. C. I want to talk to that kid. He's got the look of a future sax man about him. He came over to our table. Miss Thomas asked me, Do you mind if I order supper, Bud? I said, No, ma'am. I couldn't believe you got to order what you wanted. I thought you just sat down and they bring you whatever you wanted from the stove. The woman came up to the table and she said, Y'all ready, Miss Thomas? Miss Thomas said, We sure are, Tyler. Tyler said, Who's this little feather? Did you all pick up someone new for the band? Miss Thomas laughed. They're getting younger all the time, aren't they? This here's Bud, and he's going to be our guest for a while, so I want to impress him with something special. Tyler said, Well, you know who brought him to the right place. It's nice to meet you, Bud. I said, Pleased to meet you, ma'am. She said, Ma'am, mercy, Miss Thomas. Your guest has some real fine manners. I can tell that this isn't one of your rude, crude folks Mr. Calloway usually scours up. Steady Eddie said, Tyler, I'm crushed. She said, Bud, I apologize for mistaking you for a musician. I told her, That's okay, ma'am. No offense taken. Miss Thomas said, Is there any more of that meatloaf left? Yes, ma'am. Sure is. How about some okra mashed potatoes, too, Bud? Thank you, ma'am. And does a glass of apple cider sound good? Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Okay, she said. I'll have the same. Mr. Jimmy ordered supper. That was all the way different from mine. Steady Eddie ordered one of the that was all the way different from his. No wonder you hear about rich folks going to restaurants once a week. This was great. Miss Tyler went away and Miss Thomas started back on me. Bud, I've got to let you know that I'm pretty sure there's just no way Mr. C is your father. Tell me what gave you the idea he was. My mother did, ma'am. Miss Thomas looked over at Mr. Jimmy real quick and said, Sweetheart, did you know a whole lot of people over the state know Mr. C? Did you know he's pretty famous? No, ma'am. Ah, well, you know what I think? I think maybe your mother heard him on the radio or heard somebody talking about him and saw the band somewhere and told you that Mr. C reminded her of your father and you misunderstood what she meant. Isn't that possible? I don't think so, ma'am. She looked at me for a second. Did he come out and say your daddy is Hermione Calloway, Bud? Well, almost, but not in words just like that. Then tell me the words that were like, honey. Uh-oh, this is going to be hard to explain. Miss Thomas thought Mighty Maple's hints from flyers. As long as I kept Hermione Calloway being my father to myself, the whole thing made good sense. But as soon as I tried to tell the other folks about it, it seemed like maybe it was something that stupid kid had dreamed up. Like I was wishing and hoping instead of something true and real. I looked down at my suitcase. Well, and I could tell my luck was changing. Before I could say anything, Miss Tyler was at our table with a tray. Miss Thomas reached across the table, patted my hand. We'll talk tomorrow, bud. I bet you're sick and tired of answering people's questions, aren't you? I said, yes, ma'am. But I did notice she said tomorrow. That might mean they weren't going to try to send me back to Flint right away. Miss Tyler said, Miss Thomas, and set a plate down in front of her. Mr. Jimmy, and gave him some food too. Then steady, and put a plate down and rattled a little bit. Then said, and finally, the young gentleman, and put a plate crammed with food in front of me. It was the best meal I'd ever had. And when it was done, Miss Tyler brought me a dessert she called on the house. It was a piece of warm sweet potato pie with some fluffy stuff called whipped cream swapped all over it. I shoved the last crumb of pie in my mouth and I scraped the last dribbles of whipped cream. I looked around at the table and I couldn't help but breaking out in a big smile. I didn't see it before, but now that I looked, I could tell that Miss Thomas must have been the most beautiful woman in the world. When she talked, she moved her hands and fingers around like the lights were from the ceiling, and from the little candles on the tables would bounce off them like diamonds and spark up your eye and make you feel like you'd been hit with some kind of magic, fairy dust. Then all you couldn't do, you could help but smile. All the while, she'd hum too. But hum doesn't seem like it was the right word for it, what she was doing. Most of the times I heard humming before it was just an excuse for not being able to sit still, or something people do if they don't know the words to a song. Uh huh. That doesn't fit the sounds that Mrs. Thomas was making. I could help. I couldn't help but look at wonder at how the real human being was making these noises or these sounds. What her humming reminded me most of was feeling like you get when you walk barefoot on a railroad track for a long time before you can see it. You can feel the train right through the bottom of your feet. Her humming started slow and easy at first, but just like that, you could feel like a shake, a shake, a shake, a shaking from somewhere far off, while Miss Thomas' humming made you feel like something big and strong was passing by you, and everything was getting rattly and shaky and about to get shook loose. It made you want to drop your fork and grab a hold of something solid. From hearing this just a little bit of humming, I could understand why Mr. Jimmy didn't call her a singer. A singer wasn't enough big enough word to take the kind of music that was jumping out of Miss Thomas's chest. I didn't notice how funny Mr. Jimmy was. His stories is telling about traveling around the country with Hermione Calloway had us all laughing so much that even the nosy people at all the other tables could hear ours quit eating and were busting their guts, throwing 2 cents into the stories. The only table that was quiet was there was dusky devastators were sitting. It seemed like Hermione Calloway could make you sit. You just wanted to sit and watch your hands and with a sad look on your face. And I had noticed it before since Steady Eddie was either. He talked about out the side of his mouth and kept his eyes kind of blinked halfway down, especially when Miss Tyler would come to our table to see if we were all right, which she did a lot. And he was the first person I'd ever seen who could eat and talk and laugh and drink and sneeze whilst keeping a toothpick dangling out of his mouth, no matter what he do with that toothpick. Always stayed dancing just below his mustache. And Steady Eddie took his time to show me how to hold my lips and how to put my fingers like it was real playing a pretend saxophone. I'm not sure exactly what happened. If it was when I was scraping up the last drops of melted whipped cream, or if it was when Miss Thomas's fingers got to flinging all that magic fairy dust. But sometime whilst I was sitting in sweet pie, another seed got to sprout something. Sometime like it smells like heaven place. Another maple started digging down its roots and grabbing hold. One second I was laughing my head off, the next second I was feeling surprised because something hit me just so hard. Snaggletooth Mac McNevin had smacked Hermione Calloway. All of a sudden I knew that all the places in the world I've ever been, and this was one, that all of the people I'd ever met, that these were the ones. These were the ones I was supposed to be with. And Hermione Calloway could kiss my wrist if he thought he was going to scare me out of this. It was going to take more than a grouchy old bald headed guy with a tremendous belly to run me out of here. I was smiling and laughing and busting a gut so much that I got carried away with some rusty old valve squeaked open in me, and then I said, whoop, zoop, zoop. Tears started jumping out of my eyes so hard I had to cover my face with the big red and white napkin that was on the table. I hadn't been this embarrassed since I woke up and found Mrs. Sleet looking at my legs. I couldn't tell that everybody at Sweet Pie stopped laughing and talking and started looking at me, but I still couldn't quit bawling. Mama used to tell me I'd only get one chance to make a first impression. It looked like I was blowing it with the dusky devastator's depression. Shucks. Finally, I had to put my face and my arms on the table and the napkin over my head like I was blanketed because I tried as hard as I wanted. I didn't look like I was going to get the doggone valve to close anytime soon. I felt Miss Thomas's hand under my napkin rub real soft and slow forth over my head. She pulled me out of the chair and onto her lap, and she wrapped her arms around me, and she bounced me up and down on her knee. Dang, I never knew any kind of reputation with the band now. The only thing I could do was hang on to the napkin and try to make it so folks would not notice how wet my face was. She said in a real quiet, I was the only one who could hear it. Okay, baby. Okay, okay. I know, sweetheart. I know. Then she started humming again with that in my ear, mashed up against my chest. Like all my bones and muscles quit doing their job, and I felt like something as big as a steam locomotive engine was chugging, chugging, chugging away past my ear. I wasn't sure if it was her lips or her hand, but something whispered in a language that I didn't have any trouble understanding. It said, "Go ahead and cry, bud. You're home."